He thought it was just another walk in the woods. But what they found later will haunt you. A missing person's trail begins with small, ordinary objects. Clues left behind like whispers in the dark. Piece by piece, the evidence tells a story no one expected. The police have gathered several disturbing leads. But will they be enough to solve the mystery? He thought it was just another walk in the woods. But what they found later will haunt you forever, leaving everyone shocked and terrified. The school had always been considered one of the safest places in the small suburban town, a brick building with long echoing hallways, faded murals painted years earlier by children who had already grown up, and a playground that looked out onto a row of quiet houses where the routine of life rarely changed. But everything was shattered on the morning when two boys, both 11 years old, vanished during the short recess between classes, slipping away as if the air itself had swallowed them. And no one realized at first what had happened because recess was chaotic. Children ran in all directions, teachers tried to keep order, and when the bell rang again everyone rushed inside. Except when attendance was checked, the seats of those two boys were empty, their books still on the desks, their bags under the chairs, and yet they were nowhere to be found, which sparked immediate confusion, first from the teacher, then from the administration, then from frantic parents called in the middle of their workday, and soon from the police who arrived with quiet urgency, cordoning off the building and starting the kind of search no one in the town had ever thought necessary. What puzzled investigators most in the first hours was the security system, because the school had a set of cameras covering hallways, entrances, and parts of the playground, and yet when the footage was reviewed frame by frame there was no sign of the boys leaving, no blurred figures slipping out of a door, no glimpse of them passing through a hallway, nothing at all, as if the cameras had simply decided not to record them, and the officers replayed it again and again, asking technicians to confirm there was no glitch, no skipped footage. But the hard drive showed nothing suspicious, everything looked normal, and the boys' last verifiable appearance was just before the bell rang for recess. After that they vanished without trace, a fact that spread through the town like wildfire, bringing parents to the gates in tears, children whispering in fear, and media trucks parking outside by afternoon. The first night, police searched the entire building from top to bottom, every classroom, supply closet, boiler room, attic crawlspace, but found nothing, and as they turned to the boys' personal belongings, they gathered their backpacks, books, and folders, hoping for a clue, anything to explain whether this had been a runaway, a kidnapping, or something even stranger. It was in the exercise books that an unsettling discovery was made, because in the lined pages, between math problems and half-written essays, were scribbled notes in an uneven hand, words that seemed not like the thoughts of children but like fragments of some warning, and both books carried similar entries. "We are still in the school," one read, written in faint pencil as though hurried. "Do not leave us here," said another, and yet the boys had not written them in front of anyone, and the handwriting did not fully match either child's regular script, causing investigators to wonder if they had written it in a state of panic or if someone else had done it, planting the words to confuse, and this detail sent shivers through parents and detectives alike, because the words implied presence, not absence, as if the boys were hidden somewhere still within those walls, even though every inch had already been searched. Days passed, the search spreading outward across fields, into nearby woods, down creeks where volunteers waded in mud, helicopters sweeping overhead, dogs sniffing in vain, and still the notebooks echoed in everyone's mind, "We are still in the school." Teachers who had taught in the building for decades began to recall odd little details, the basement that was locked for years, the old blueprints that showed areas sealed off long ago, the unexplored storage rooms. Yet every time officers went through, nothing was found, and the growing lack of answers deepened the despair, until a week later when chance revealed what methodical searching had not. It was late afternoon, classes dismissed, the hallways nearly empty, when a teacher stayed behind to gather papers and lock her classroom, walking down one of the older corridors where tiles creaked underfoot, and as she stepped just past a row of lockers her shoe pressed against something soft where the floor should have been solid, a strange give in the linoleum, like stepping on carpet soaked with water, and she froze, pressing again, feeling it sag, and in that moment a crack ran across the tile with a brittle sound, breaking apart to reveal rotten wood beneath, and then with a sharp snap a corner collapsed, exposing a darkness below and a stench of damp air that rushed upward. Heart pounding, the teacher bent down, shining the flashlight of her phone into the gap, and what she saw made her stagger back against the lockers because beneath the school, where no one believed space existed, there yawned a hidden chamber, a basement or sublevel unknown to any staff, stretching into shadows, with stairs descending into gloom. Police were called instantly, and when they widened the hole and lowered their lights they saw rough stone walls, old brickwork, signs that the chamber had existed since the building was first constructed but had been forgotten, sealed away in renovations, and down there in the flickering beams of flashlights stood a man, gaunt, pale, his eyes wide against the sudden brightness, holding back two terrified boys who blinked and squinted after a week in the dark. Officers stormed the hidden space, overpowering the man, pulling the children up into the corridor where they clung to the rescuers and wept as their names were called out to confirm they were alive, though thin, bruised, and frightened, and the teachers above stood in horrified silence, realizing the nightmare that had been unfolding right beneath their feet all along. The man was dragged up, screaming, incoherent, while parents rushed in as soon as the scene was secured, collapsing with tears around their children, and the question burned hotter than ever. Who was this man? How long had he been there? And how had the school hidden such a place from memory? Though the immediate relief of finding the boys alive swept through the town, investigators knew the story was only beginning, because the notebooks, the vanished footage, and the concealed basement pointed to something more complex than a simple kidnapping, and as the man was taken into custody he muttered words that none of the officers could fully understand, half warnings, half laughter, leaving everyone with one haunting realization. The mystery of the school had not been solved, it had only just begun. The discovery of the hidden basement and the rescue of the two missing boys should have marked the end of the nightmare, a shocking chapter closed by relief and justice, but instead it marked the beginning of deeper questions, because although the man who had been found in that forgotten chamber beneath the school was arrested, booked, and locked behind bars, nothing about his presence explained how he had managed to stay concealed for so long or why the boys' notebooks had contained messages that suggested they were still inside the school long before anyone realized the basement existed, and the more investigators pressed into the details, the stranger the case became, drawing media attention from across the state, unsettling teachers and parents, and shaking the entire community. The boys were returned to their families, exhausted but alive, and in the first days after their rescue the town tried to celebrate their survival with balloons and banners and school assemblies filled with applause. Yet underneath the joy there was unease, because the children spoke little of what had happened during the week they were held, their eyes often drifting to silence when questions came, and when pressed by detectives they answered only in fragments. They said the man had lured them during recess, pulling them toward a storage closet no one ever used, and from there they were taken down through a trapdoor hidden beneath rotting boards. But when asked why they never screamed, why no one heard them, they looked confused, almost as if they could not remember clearly, repeating only that, "He told us not to," and "He said the floor was alive," phrases that chilled every adult who heard them. At the police station the man was identified as someone who had no clear ties to the school, no employment record, no history in the district, and yet when they checked his fingerprints and background, a stranger fact emerged. His identity did not match any known record, no driver's license, no social security number, no family connections, nothing at all, which led to speculation that he had been living under false names for years, drifting from place to place, until somehow burrowing his way into the school's hidden foundation. His interrogation yielded little clarity. He spoke in mutters, sometimes laughing, sometimes repeating lines that made no sense, insisting that "the children called to me first," and "the school has always kept its own secrets," statements that investigators initially dismissed as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, though in private they could not shake the feeling that he was referencing something none of them understood. Reporters filled the town, interviewing teachers, students, parents, and soon whispers began to spread that the notebooks themselves contained evidence of something stranger, because handwriting analysts confirmed the messages, "We are still in the school," did not exactly match either of the boys. Yet no one else could have written them, and ink tests showed they were fresh, written just before the boys disappeared, which left detectives staring at the words with growing unease, for they implied knowledge the boys themselves might not have consciously possessed. Meanwhile, the structural engineers brought in to survey the collapsed floor announced that the hidden basement was much larger than anyone first believed, stretching into a network of unfinished rooms, some sealed, some half buried under dirt, suggesting that during the original construction decades ago additional levels were planned and then forgotten, sealed off and undocumented, which meant the man who had hidden there had access to far more space than the narrow chamber where he was caught. And the idea unsettled everyone, especially parents who now wondered how such a place could have existed under the feet of hundreds of children for generations without ever being noticed. Teachers recalled rumors passed down from older staff about strange noises in the night or cold drafts through certain hallways, stories dismissed as old building quirks, But now investigators took them seriously, mapping the substructure, discovering locked doors that had not been opened in decades, and each time they pried one open the air that rushed out carried a stench of mold and rust and something harder to name, like memory itself made foul. Still, the greatest weight fell on the families of the boys, who despite holding their children close could not ignore the way nightmares plagued them, the way they woke in the dark whispering that someone was still calling from the floor, and though doctors attributed it to trauma, the detectives began to connect details they could not easily explain. The notebooks, the missing security footage, the way the boys insisted they had heard voices telling them where to go on that last recess. The trial of the man was set quickly, with prosecutors eager to secure a conviction for kidnapping and unlawful confinement, and yet as hearings began, journalists and lawyers demanded answers to the deeper inconsistencies, why his identity remained unconfirmed, why he claimed to know the school's secret corridors, and why the children described him as both terrifying and strangely absent, as though he had not been there with them the entire time. In court he refused to speak beyond muttering cryptic sentences, and at one point he looked directly at the families and said, "I am not the only one down there," a statement that froze the room, forcing the judge to silence him, but the words echoed in everyone's minds as the gavel struck. Even after he was sentenced and taken to prison, the detectives assigned to the case found themselves unable to let go, continuing to study the blueprints, interview past staff, and consider whether there were more entrances to the hidden levels of the school that had not yet been discovered, because if the man had lived there undetected for so long, feeding on what scraps, moving through tunnels, then perhaps he had not been alone, or perhaps the boys had seen something else during that week. That fear now prevented them from describing. One of the detectives, a veteran who had once lost a sibling to a disappearance years earlier, sat at his desk night after night rereading the strange lines in the notebooks, circling the words, "Do not leave us here," and wondering who exactly had been writing them. And when the boys were asked again under careful questioning who gave them the notebooks, they swore they had only written their homework and did not remember those sentences at all, as if someone else had placed them there, someone who wanted to be found. The school board pushed to reopen quickly, promising parents that safety inspections had cleared the building, but the atmosphere was changed forever, every creak of floorboard sending shivers down spines, every dim corner of the hallway seeming to hide a secret, and though classes resumed, whispers among students only grew, stories of figures in the dark, of voices in the vents, of footsteps that echoed even when no one was walking. For the investigators, the case was officially closed, the man convicted and the boys safe. The weeks after the rescue of the two boys should have been a time of relief and healing, yet the small town and the school itself seemed unable to shake the shadow of what had been discovered beneath its floors. For even though the man who held the boys captive was behind bars and the children had returned safely to their families, a deep unease hung over every hallway, classroom, and office, as if the walls themselves held on to secrets no one wanted to confront, and whispers spread from parent to parent and teacher to teacher that perhaps the man had not acted alone, that someone else had known about the hidden basement, because how could such a vast and concealed place exist in a public building without any trace in records, construction files, or past inspections, and yet it had been there, solid and real, trapping children only steps away from where other students laughed, studied, and ran during recess. And when the police released their official statement claiming the case was closed with the suspect's arrest, not everyone was convinced, especially not Detective Harris, the investigator who had spent sleepless nights going through the boys' strange notebooks filled with cryptic entries, pages marked with sentences like, "We are still here," and "The basement listens," writings that seemed impossible because the boys had been trapped during the week they were supposedly making those notes, and Harris could not understand how handwriting identical to the children's kept appearing in notebooks that teachers swore had been locked in desks or left at home, and even the parents admitted the pages were new, written after the children were missing, though they could not explain by whom, and so Harris began to return alone to the school late at night, walking its empty corridors with only the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the distant creak of aging pipes echoing around him, his flashlight sweeping over lockers, bulletin boards, and polished tile, until he found himself standing over the very spot where the floor had given way beneath the teacher's foot, the broken boards replaced hastily by maintenance crews but still slightly uneven, a scar on the building that drew him closer like a wound that had never truly healed, and though he had been in the basement before with a full team, seeing the man, the terrified boys, and the makeshift prison of mattresses and old furniture, something compelled him to descend again, to test whether the silence of that underground place hid more than chains and shadows, so he pried open the boards, lowered himself by ladder, and stood once more in the stale air, the faint smell of mildew and rust filling his lungs, the beam of his light cutting through the darkness, landing on the stains of old blankets and the rusted frame of a bed where the children had been held, and for a moment he thought it was just as they had left it, abandoned and lifeless, until he noticed on the far wall a message he had not seen before, written in uneven chalk letters as though scrawled by a trembling hand. Still here, and beneath it the date of that very morning, hours after the suspect had been locked away, and Harris felt his skin crawl as he reached out, touching the chalk to confirm it was fresh, not dust or residue from before, and as he pulled his hand away he heard a faint sound, not footsteps, not voices, but a dragging shuffle that seemed to come from behind another section of wall. And when he pressed his ear against it he realized there was hollow space beyond, a hidden chamber within the hidden basement, and suddenly everything about the case seemed unfinished. The man in prison only a part of something larger, the boy's notebooks not just ramblings but warnings, and Harris knew that if he walked away and left this new discovery untended, more children could vanish, more lives could be swallowed by the secrets buried under the school. So he marked the wall, steadied himself, and promised silently that he would return with reinforcements, though a darker thought whispered in his mind, that maybe the very people he worked with, the ones who declared the case closed so quickly, did not want this wall broken, that someone above him might already know what lay hidden. And as he climbed out of the basement that night, locking the door behind him, he felt both the weight of the mystery and the certainty that the story was far from over, because in his pocket he now carried one more piece of evidence, a scrap of paper he had found near the chalk writing, folded and torn, bearing a single line in the same handwriting as the notebooks. "We never left." Detective Harris could not shake the feeling that the case was not over, that the arrest of the man who had been found in the basement was only the surface of something deeper, and the strange chalk writing on the wall, fresh, impossible, and taunting, stayed with him through sleepless nights as he pored over the boy's notebooks again and again, tracing the odd phrases that had first unsettled the police, like, "We are in the school," and "The walls keep secrets," words that now seemed less like childish imagination and more like testimony from a place no one was supposed to know. And as the days passed he became more determined to break through the hidden wall he had discovered, the one behind which he had heard the faint dragging shuffle, a sound that echoed in his memory with unnatural persistence. So late one night he returned, this time not calling anyone from his department, because he feared that if he did the site would be sealed, reported, and quietly dismissed as though it never existed. So he carried his own tools, a crowbar, a hammer, a flashlight with spare batteries, and once more pried open the repaired boards of the school floor, descending into the stale, dark basement that seemed to breathe with the weight of all that had happened there, and standing before the chalk message he steadied his nerves before striking the wall, the hollow thud confirming his suspicion that something lay beyond, each swing of the hammer cracking the plaster and sending echoes across the chamber until at last a piece gave way, revealing a narrow gap and a rush of air colder than the room around him. And when he pushed the flashlight through he saw another space, narrower, with brick walls lined in places with shelves that held old notebooks, boxes, and scraps of clothing too small for any adult. And his stomach turned as he realized this was not just an extension of the basement but another room deliberately hidden. And as he widened the hole and slipped inside he saw that the walls were covered in more writing, but not chalk this time, carved, scratched deep into the surface as if by fingernails or sharp metal, hundreds of names repeating over and over, some familiar from missing person cases in the county, names that had never been linked to this school before, and among them, freshly carved, were the names of the two boys he had just helped rescue, and beside them 2 more names he did not recognize, names that he would later discover belonged to children reported missing only a month prior in a neighboring town, children no one had ever connected to the case, and Harris felt the world tilt as he realized this hidden chamber suggested a history far longer and more disturbing than anyone had considered, a pattern that stretched back years, perhaps decades, yet hidden in plain sight beneath classrooms where generations of children had studied, laughed, and grown up unaware of the nightmare beneath their feet. And then he saw something else, a chair bolted to the ground in the corner, with restraints attached, old but still functional, and beside it a small desk with another notebook lying open, its most recent entry written in a hand that looked like the captured man's, but the date was from just 2 nights ago, long after he had been locked in prison, and Harris's pulse quickened as he read the words, "They are not gone, they are only waiting." And before he could process what that meant, he heard a faint sound again, a scrape against stone, and the beam of his flashlight caught movement at the far end of the chamber, a shadow withdrawing into darkness where a crack in the wall suggested yet another passage, too narrow to follow immediately, but undeniable proof that someone or something was still down here. And for the first time Harris felt real fear that he was no longer alone, so he backed away, marking the spot carefully and sealing the wall as best he could on his way out, because he knew that if he told his superiors everything exactly as it was they would dismiss him or worse, bury the discovery, and he needed time to gather evidence, to understand whether the man in prison was just a pawn in something larger. But when he returned to his car that night and checked his phone, he found a new message waiting, no number attached, just a single sentence glowing on the screen: "You should not have opened the wall." And his hands trembled as he looked back at the silent school, realizing that someone was watching, someone who knew his every step. And the case was no longer about two missing boys. It was about a secret far older and darker than the community dared to admit, one that was only beginning to reveal itself. Detective Harris knew the message on his phone was not just a coincidence, not some prank, but a direct warning from someone who had been inside the school that very night, someone who had watched him break through the hidden wall and enter the second chamber. And as much as he tried to convince himself that he still had control of the case, deep inside he felt the ground shifting beneath him, just like the broken boards where the teacher had first stumbled into the basement. And yet he could not stop, because the moment he saw those carved names on the wall, names of children long gone, names no one had connected, he understood that if he turned away now he would be leaving behind an entire history of victims whose voices had been silenced, whose families never knew the truth. So he returned the following day, pretending to his colleagues that he was simply reviewing the original crime scene again. But this time he carried a camera, recording every detail of the hidden chamber, every mark on the wall, every strange item left behind, especially the notebook with a handwriting that matched the imprisoned man yet contained dates impossible for him to have written. And when Harris compared the handwriting samples later, he was chilled to see that they were identical down to the slant of each letter, something no imitation could easily produce. And he began to consider the unthinkable possibility that the man they had arrested had not been working alone, perhaps not even as the mastermind, but as part of something larger, a network or tradition that stretched far beyond a single individual. And when Harris searched deeper into Old Town records, he found that the school had been rebuilt twice, once in the 1950s and once in the late 1800s, yet in neither set of blueprints was there any mention of basements or substructures, and yet here they were, with chambers that looked older than the foundation itself, as though the school had been built on top of something that already existed, something meant to remain hidden. And the more he read through the boy's strange notebooks, the more he realized the children themselves had sensed things others could not, pages describing sounds of whispers through the floor, drawings of staircases leading nowhere, and shadows in places where no windows could explain them. And though he wanted to dismiss these as frightened imaginations, the carvings in the secret chamber proved otherwise. And then a break came in the case. When Harris received an anonymous envelope at his office, containing two photographs, one of the hidden wall before he had broken it, as though someone had been watching him in the basement, and the other of himself standing in the chamber, flashlight in hand, unaware of being photographed, and scrawled across the bottom in red marker were the words, "You are next to be written," and Harris's blood ran cold. Because this was no longer about uncovering old crimes. It was about survival, and whoever had maintained these chambers, whoever continued the ritual of capturing children, now saw him as an intruder who had trespassed too far. And yet the detective refused to stop, and one night he returned again, this time with a small drill and sensors to test the wall where he had heard movement, the crack too narrow to enter before, and after hours of careful work he managed to widen it enough to squeeze through into yet another hidden passage, narrower than the others, stretching downward into darkness, the air colder and heavier with each step, until he entered a space that froze him in place, a circular room with stone walls older than any part of the school, lined with benches and strange symbols carved into the rock, symbols that repeated across every surface, spirals and markings he could not decipher, and in the center of the floor was a pit covered by wooden boards, chained shut, as though something had once been kept inside, and Harris crouched to study it, his flashlight flickering as though straining against the darkness, when suddenly he heard footsteps echoing behind him, slow, deliberate, not hurried but confident, and when he spun around the beam of his light caught only the edge of a figure retreating back into the passage, tall, thin, and silent, vanishing before he could follow, and when he gave chase he found the wall sealed again, as though no one had ever been there, leaving him alone in the chamber with the pit, the chains rattling softly, as though moved by unseen hands, and Harris realized he had stumbled into something much larger than an ordinary crime, something that had survived for generations beneath the school, and that the man in prison might only have been one keeper in a long line of them. And as he climbed back out that night, exhausted and shaken, he understood two things with absolute certainty, that the boys had not been the first victims, and they would not be the last unless he uncovered everything, but also that he was no longer investigating quietly, because whoever was still in those tunnels now knew his name, his face, and his every step, and soon, very soon, they would come for him. Detective Harris had reached the point where every step deeper into the case felt like stepping into quicksand. The more he uncovered, the more the ground threatened to swallow him whole. Yet he could not turn away because the hidden chambers beneath the school were no longer just a crime scene. They were a labyrinth of history, a record of disappearances stretching back generations. And as much as his superiors insisted, the case was closed with the arrest of the man found in the first basement. Harris knew the truth was much darker, for he had seen the carvings of names that matched children long missing. He had seen the symbols on the walls of the circular chamber. He had seen the pit sealed with chains as though something unspeakable had been kept within it. And above all, he had seen a figure retreating into the tunnels that could not have been imagined, proof that someone else still walked freely beneath the school, watching, waiting, perhaps continuing a ritual no one above the floorboards dared to admit existed, and the message on his phone, the photographs of him inside the chamber, all told him he was being tracked, his investigation no longer secret. Yet he pressed forward because he knew if he stopped, more children could vanish. And so Harris began connecting dots outside the school, reviewing cold cases from nearby towns, tracing property records, discovering that every time the school had been rebuilt after fire or damage, the same construction company had been involved, a company that no longer officially existed but whose name appeared in documents as far back as the 1800s, always tied to buildings where strange disappearances were rumored, and though he could not prove it in court, he felt certain he was brushing against the edges of something like a society, a network, or perhaps even a cult that had used schools and basements as their hunting ground, feeding off the secrecy of places where children gathered. And when he brought this suspicion to a colleague he trusted, the man begged him to drop it, warning him that some doors could not be closed once opened, that there were people above him in government or law enforcement who knew about the chambers and chose silence. And Harris realized that if he wanted the truth, he would have to risk everything, his career, his safety, perhaps even his life. And so one final time he returned to the school, alone, descending through the cracked boards and into the tunnels, past the chamber of names, past the carved walls, until he stood again before the chained pit. And this time he forced the locks open, the sound of snapping metal echoing like gunfire through the stone. And when he pulled back the boards, he found not a drop into emptiness but a narrow stairway spiraling downward into blackness, older stonework damp with age, steps leading into the earth as though into another world, and with each step he felt a pressure growing in his chest, the air thicker, colder, until at last he reached the bottom, a cavern that opened into a vast underground hall, larger than anything he could have imagined beneath a school, its walls lined with alcoves where small objects had been placed, shoes, toys, bits of fabric, hundreds of them, trophies of the stolen, and in the center stood a stone altar, smooth and worn with age, stained dark, surrounded by more of the spiraled symbols he had seen above, and standing near it were three figures, cloaked, motionless, their faces obscured, and, though Harris drew his gun and shouted, his words seemed to vanish into the heavy air, the figures not moving, not speaking, until one slowly raised a hand and pointed directly at him. And in that instant he felt the weight of centuries pressing down, as if the floor itself were alive and aware, and his flashlight flickered before going out, plunging him into a darkness broken only by the faint glow of symbols carved into the walls, glowing as though lit from within, and Harris stumbled backward, firing blindly, the sound deafening in the cavern, and when his light returned for a moment he saw the figures were gone, no trace but the echo of their steps retreating deeper into the tunnels, and he understood that he had not ended anything, that he had only peeled back a corner of a truth that stretched far beyond his reach, and though he made it out of the pit, sealing it again behind him, his report was dismissed, filed away, labeled speculative, while the town above carried on, as though nothing had happened, the children playing, the classrooms filling. But Harris knew, and in the months that followed he began to notice things. Faces watching him from across the street, letters slipped under his door with only symbols drawn on them, the names of children who had not yet gone missing appearing in his mail before their disappearances were even reported, and he realized he had been marked, that the network beneath the school now counted him as part of its story. That one day his own name might be carved into the walls of the hidden chamber, joining the countless others in the darkness, and though he fought to stay ahead, though he warned families and moved from place to place, the sense of inevitability haunted him. For the last page of the final notebook he had taken from the chamber remained etched in his memory, words that had not yet come true but that he feared would. He found us, but he will not leave.